You're listening to the Quint's podcast.
Welcome to Season 2 of the Quint Fortnightly podcast, Land of a Billion. We aim to bring you expert conversations about the most contentious of the holy roti kapda makan trinity, that is, the makan over our heads and the larger ecosystem that governs it. This podcast is produced in association with the Property Rights Research Consortium, supported by Umidiyar Network India. I'm Bhargavi, a researcher interested in land and access to finance, and your host for this season. We all know of at least one family member, friend, colleague, neighbor who has faced builder trouble, where a developer has either not delivered possession on time or has delivered premises that are leaky or otherwise defective, or having delivered the premises has refused to execute a conveyance in favor of the cooperative housing society, or the occupation certificate is pending, or the completion certificate is pending, and so on and so forth. The thuggery of real estate agents in India is also the stuff of folklore. This was best personified in a 2006 Hindi movie, Khosla Ka Ghosla, where Vinod Khosla, who had invested his life savings in a plot of land to build a retirement home, did not end up getting that plot of land because of a land grab issue. Not exactly similar, but in 2015-16, we saw several developers like Amrapali and JP being taken to the insolvency courts by homeowners who had given advances but were never given their homes. Today, as we speak, we see a similar issue emerging in China for Evergrande, a large developer who has similarly gone bankrupt without delivering the homes and having taken advances for building them. When it comes to real estate in India, my favorite data point, which I use very, very often, is that 77% of the average Indian household portfolio is invested in real estate. That is, a large chunk of most Indians' savings is invested in a home, an office, a retirement home, or a plot of land. It is therefore surprising that despite land being such an integral part of an Indian household's life, the consumer protection in the real estate development sector was rather weak until recently, when in 2015, the Real Estate Regulation and Development Act was enacted to provide for a stronger consumer protection framework in the real estate development space. 5 years hence, how has the law fared? As per a recent BCG report published in June 2021, 26 of 29 states have a basic RERA set up in place. But has RERA really made a difference to the confidence that consumers have when buying real estate property in India? Have the awareness levels of consumers improved? And most importantly, does the grievance redressal work? Today, we have with us two guests who extensively follow this space very closely. We have with us Neetu Vasanta, who is the managing director and partner in BCG's New Delhi office and leads the real estate vertical for BCG in India. She's also a core member of BCG's industrial goods practice area. We also have with us Shilpa Kumar, who is partner at Umidiyar Network India, a social impact investment fund. Shilpa provides overall leadership, including strategy and investments, across the areas of digital society, urban governance, access to justice, and property rights initiative. Welcome, Neetu and Shilpa, to the Land of a Billion podcast. Great being here, Bhargavi.
Thanks for the opportunity.
Let's begin with setting the context in which this law was enacted. Can you tell us what was it like before this law was passed? What were the problems that this law tried to address?
Sure, let me take that. First of all, thank you for the brilliant introduction. Let me start with some numbers, right? Real estate, as we understand, is close to 6.5, 7% of GDP and employs over 50 million people and has a huge multiplier effect when it comes to employment. But that's one part of the story. Why is real estate and anything to do with real estate important? I think personally, it's the second part of the story which you touched upon. It's about many Mr. Costas, which at least 5 to 6 years ago had put in all of their life saving into buying a property. 77%. Yes, that's the percentage of saving that every man puts into buying a real estate space. And what's even starker is 75% of that money is for self-use. So it's not like an investment where I'll reap benefits. It's really about buying a home or a shop where I will live in or where I will work. And unfortunately, at least 6-7 years ago, this whole sector was fraught with problems, right? There was very limited accountability of the developers. A lot of laws, as we saw, were in favor of developers. There was complete information asymmetry. When is the project coming up? How do I track it? There was limited digital information available to the consumers who had paid up in advance. There was very little, close to nil, financial disclosure when it came to real estate. So as Mr. Khosla, you had given a large chunk of money, but you never knew whether the developer has got the land approval, whether the developer will start construction, what is the timeline like. Somebody promised you something, and then you're just blank. I think the other system was, it was not just between the developer and the consumer. There was just a complete lack of trust in the entire ecosystem. The financiers didn't know what projects they could or could not finance. The brokers were not aware of what were they trying to sell. The architects didn't know when the developer would go bust. And then we had a lot of these infamous developers doing stuff that we've all read a lot in the news about. So there was a complete vicious cycle, if I may call it, of mistrust in the entire system. And in a sector where people are pouring in all their savings, there is just very limited accountability. I think it called for an action immediately. And that was why RERA came into effect, right? The primary cause was, how do you bring back consumer trust? How do you make sure that it's a level playing field for the consumers as well as the developers? And then how do you bring the trust back into the entire ecosystem? That was really the backdrop of why RERA came in. And I think we're 5 years into it. I think there's a lot that has happened, right? Again, like used to say, let me start with the numbers. India's global real estate transparency rank, which was 41 in 2016 when RERA was launched, is already up to 33. Can it get better? Of course. But I think, that's also a journey that we've traversed. If I talk about the different impact that it has had on different stakeholders, I think, for me, the top five would be: one, I think it has truly brought transparency to the real estate sector. In our report, where we interviewed more than 1,300 stakeholders and also developers and real estate agents, most people, 80% of the consumers said that they would only buy a property which is RERA registered. It is because they still have faith that if a property is registered with RERA, they will get information on time. There will be some accountability of the builder, and they know who to reach out to in case something goes wrong. So that's number one. I think just bringing transparency to the sector and having information available to the consumer. I think the second thing which has happened is, honestly, I feel builder accountability has increased. People who could get away with not filing documents on time are now being made to at least publish their results every 3 months. And that has also put a lot of pressure on them to clean up their internal books. So I think that for me would be number two. I also feel that, because of the regulation and because of the transparency and the accountability, service and project delivery have actually improved. I think, the other good part is that it has actually inched a lot towards protecting consumer rights. People now have a redressal forum. Some states are doing exceptionally well on, resolving some of the conflicts even before it comes to the redressal forum. And I think in general, consumer rights are being protected. And I think last but not the least, it is reversed the vicious cycle on the antitrust movement. So now there is actually a greater trust amongst different stakeholders. People trust the developers who are RERA registered. The architects also know that the funds which were going into the project are actually kept in the project. The financiers feel a lot more comfortable, and of course, the consumers feel a lot more comfortable. So I would just say that it has put the wheels in motion in the right direction. There's a long way to go, but I think we've already seen a lot of improvement.
That's great. Thanks, Neetu. So, just a couple of points, right? I completely agree on the trust point. And even for our listeners, I mean, just look at under construction real estate projects around you. what you'll find is that, at least this is what I've observed in the city of Bombay, is that these big hoardings actually prominently display that it is a RERA registered project. And now, if I don't see that on a hoarding, I begin to wonder, oh, is this okay? Is this not okay? And that, I mean, conventional economics would suggest that consumers actually respond to these kind of things, and that's why developers actually bother putting it up on the hoarding, right? So that's one thing. The second is, the timing of this law. This law came about in about 2016, 17. And at the same time, there was another phenomenon going on in India, which is the enactment of the insolvency and bankruptcy law. And I think there were, the newspapers were filled up to the brim with headlines of various developers being dragged to the insolvency courts by consumers who had not been paid, who had given advances for their flats but were not being, either the flats were not delivered to them or the interest has stopped flowing in. And then we were, the insolvency law was looked at like this place where even consumer rights of homeowners could be sort of enforced through insolvency, which is not exactly a great outcome. So RERA actually saved the day in many ways for both the developers, because consumers could now actually use a proper consumer protection law that would protect their rights, as opposed to directly, hitting the insolvency courts with insolvency of developers. But that's just a thought out there in terms of the timing of the law, right? And Shilpa, what do you think? I mean, do you really believe that RERA has actually strengthened transparency? Do you think it has improved confidence of consumers in the real estate sector? What are your views on how the law has panned out on the ground?
Yeah. So, Bhargavi, you mentioned your favorite factoid when you started about, almost three-fourths of a person's assets being in their house or land. And the flip side, to that factoid is civil cases in India, as you well know, a bulk of them actually relate to land and house disputes. And to me, this the flip sides of the two coin always really amazed me, that the largest asset class and also the most litigated asset class in the country. And I also agree with you that the 5 years before this act came were actually probably some of the most turbulent times in the real estate sector. And therefore, if you look at the results of this survey, I think one big takeaway is that it has helped improve customer confidence. It has helped support developers who can now rely on RERA kind of registration to sell their projects. And therefore, it has really brought back confidence into the sector and brought back confidence into customers buying homes. I think that did come across. But Bhargavi, if you were to peel the onion a little bit more, I think what's interesting is that the customer, the consumer, seems to be almost thinking of RERA registration as the hallmark of everything being okay once they have invested. And this really came home to me because as we were discussing the report, a friend of mine actually told me about an aunt. She says, she was so pleased with herself because she was looking to buy a home and she'd found a property and she said it's RERA registered and I don't need to worry at all. And somewhere that conversation really brings out that people kind of think a RERA registration is going to solve every problem to do with their house. And I think that's really an area to focus on, that what does this trust really mean, what should it mean? And I think that then brings us to the question of how aware are consumers, and how aware are they not just in terms of what a RERA registration means, but also how aware are customers across the country. And that's maybe something to spend a little bit of time on. And let's start with overall awareness, Bhargavi. I think the first thing is really that people in larger cities are much more aware of RERA registration compared to smaller towns. So that's the first thing. The second thing is people who are buying bigger ticket homes, 10 lakhs and above, much more aware than people who are buying smaller homes. The third thing is, and that's really what I was speaking about, is the depth of awareness. That mostly people say RERA registration means I have somebody who's going to protect me, give me timely completion of my project, and if something goes wrong, I will be protected. That's really what people seem to be kind of thinking of for a RERA registration. I'd argue that, therefore, investing our energies, I mean, as a country, to really increase both the width of awareness as well as the depth of awareness can really be useful. If more people were aware that what exactly does RERA registration mean? What information can you access on a RERA website that will help you keep better track of your project? Are you aware that only a certain amount, 10%, can be taken as advance payment? Are you aware that for, changes of a certain kind in the project, approvals are required from people who have invested in the project? So, in a sense, really expanding the width and depth of awareness, I feel, can really pay rich dividends, so that the implied trust that consumers have can actually become a much more informed trust in their purchase journey.
That's an excellent point, Shilpa. Completely agree with you. RERA registration has great signaling value, but what does it really mean? And do consumers really even know what it means to be RERA registered? So it's like saying that if something is certified by a quality control agency, I just believe it to be safer. And that may be true of food products and where actual quality control is undertaken by the regulator. But what about something like a RERA registration where it's more disclosure oriented rather than quality controls and quality checks, right? So one part of it is what Shilpa brings out, which is that consumers must be aware what does it exactly mean to buy property in a RERA registered project. But then that brings me to another one, which is that consumers, I am assuming, also believe that if something goes wrong, somehow the real estate regulatory authority will protect them, either by penalizing the developer or that they will have a place to go and complain to. And that brings me to the question of enforcement capacity, which is that, do we really see that once the law has been written on the books, do you find that some states are consciously building enforcement capacity in the real estate regulatory authorities versus others? And are there interesting opportunities for learning across states that either of you all have seen? Neetu, Shilpa, any of you want to take this question? Please go ahead.
Thanks. Let me start and then, I'll request Shilpa to chime in. Look, I think one of the things we don't realize is that, while RERA was launched in 2016, different states are at very different stages of evolution when it comes to RERA, right? Today, I know you mentioned from the report, we know that 26 states have a basic RERA setup, which means that they have, a RERA body. Most of them have an appellate tribunal setup, and then they're working towards setting up a portal, right? That's what it means. Now, if you see, you spoke of Bombay. I think Maharashtra is a great example because they started much early on in the journey and they've been very consciously and actively doing certain things about it. There are states which started much later in the journey. I would pick the example of Himachal Pradesh, a very small state as compared to Maharashtra. But again, there is a lot of effort being put into making the HP RERA, stand out. They've actually got a few technology consultants to get their dashboards and their website up and running. So I do think that different states are at different stages of evolution when it comes to RERA. Certainly, there is a lot to learn from one another. Let me take examples of what some of the states are getting right. I think MP, if I start with, it is focusing a lot on digital, right? It is introduced an interactive Power BI dashboard with all the project details. It aspires to be something very close to what a Dubai has done with the REST app, right? Where you have all the real estate transactions, units sold, unit booked, the average rate, all available on an app. And that I think is a very forward-looking initiative. Gujarat, for example, has announced the launch of an investment map in the top 10 cities, right? Which with where projects can be categorized and they'll be linked to help investors make an informed decision. So it's a very, it's like simplified investment into real estate. And earlier you had to go and scout for land and then figure out what is right, what is wrong. Maharashtra is great in terms of, you mentioned grievance redressal, which still continues to be the biggest dissatisfier for everybody who's entering into a real estate transaction. They introduce something called as a conciliation or a dispute settlement forum. What it means is it's just a body before you can officially take file a complaint, it allows for, let's say a dispute settlement. And you will not believe they have a success rate of more than 70%. It's just about people sitting across the table and talking. If I trivialize it, it's just what divorce attorneys try to do before taking it to the court, right? That can you get into an amicable settlement? UP-RERA, for example, has developed a framework for grading of projects. Again, so that performance of developers and projects can be assessed, which will help the financial institutions, which will help investors. So I think there are, and I can go on about different states doing different things. I think there is a lot of great work that the states have now started to do, but I still think we are far from where we can be. If I look at a Bahrain, if I look at a Dubai, both are great examples of what a body like RERA can do. It can actually behave like a nodal point of all information, which is it is trying to be, but also proactively, facilitate investments in the sector and solve for the biggest problem, which is grievance redressal. Today, Bhargavi, you mentioned that people believe that if they are buying a RERA registered property, if something goes wrong, their problems will be solved by RERA. Unfortunately, RERA doesn't have judicial powers. So RERA cannot give a diktat. It can only take the case and to the appellate tribunal, right? It can then further recommend the case to the court. So people do have a place to pour in their grievances, but it cannot be addressed at that level. And rightfully so, right? You cannot have many judicial bodies in the country. So that's really the part of RERA. I think states have a lot to learn from each other. Central bodies like there is I for RERA, which is All India Forum for State RERAs to meet and convene. They can be a nodal body who can also help pull together states to learn from each other. The states themselves can, meet once in a while and share best practices with each other. A lot of them are doing a lot of great work. And, I think, yes, a lot of states who are, far behind in the journey can benefit from the ones which are far ahead.
Yeah, if I may chime in here, Bhargavi, because you posed, two very interesting questions. One is, in a sense, what can we do better? And then, of course, the $1 million grievance redressal question. On the first one, what can we do better? I somehow see a customer journey as first awareness, then maybe knowledge, and then really acting on that knowledge. And I think, to begin with, like we all said, the RERA mark on all billboards shows that customers are actually putting some degree of trust in that symbol. But maybe the, next step really, and it's not such a difficult step, is if customers can access the enormous knowledge that RERAs collect about projects. I mean, they collect almost more than 100 parameters for registered projects, and they have this in their databases. So the very first step is maybe encouraging consumers to visit the website, making it easy for consumers to navigate the website and access information, and in a sense, be more informed in their journey. I think that's an important first step, and in my mind, it's technology, and therefore can be done fairly simply. The interesting thing, though, Bhargavi, is what this report showed us is that only 14% of respondents actually visited RERA websites. And that's quite intriguing because, it is your biggest asset. It is very dear to you. There is a lot of information available about it, and yet very few people are accessing that information and keeping track of the project's rollout. And maybe one reason for that is when you look at, the dissatisfaction rate, which was fairly high. Almost 76% of those who visited RERA websites actually felt that the website was, it was difficult to log in. The websites were sometimes not functional, or the breadth of information was not available and, in a sense, difficult to navigate. And I think at a time when we can do so much digitally and with such digital ease, whether it's buying groceries, booking tickets, even booking your vaccine, it's really, to my mind, an easy win to really improve the quality of websites and the whole user interface and user experience for websites. So that's one thought. But moving to the second question you posed, can't agree with you more, and that's again really, I would say, at the heart of the issue, that the customer is saying, when things go wrong, I depend on RERA to solve it for me. And if we were to kind of break this up into two parts, one, do consumers go to RERA when things go wrong? And I think this report overwhelmingly points to the fact that 5 out of 6 people actually feel comfortable to go to RERA. And I think that's an enormous statement, because what it says is that the real estate consumer now heads to the RERA forum when things go wrong, over courts or over other means open to them. And I think, therefore, it's really a big opportunity for the whole RERA ecosystem to use the fact that consumers trust RERA, go to RERA when there's a problem, to actually, in a sense, help with things remaining on course, and therefore delivering maybe speedier resolution to these grievance redressals. And of course, transparency in terms of, like, maybe sharing information on how such grievances are handled could be one way of thinking about it. The other is experiments which Neetu spoke about, like conciliation, which are actually helping to get consumers, developers, and RERA all together to reach conclusion and to reach resolution. Now, let me pause here.
It's very hard to disagree with anything that both of you have said. But I just want to add one thing. On Shilpa's point regarding websites, I think it's become a bit of a joke, right? That India is the land of engineers, but our government websites are sort of the weakest, both in terms of interface, lag time, sometimes, the frequency with which they are operational, the frequency with which layouts are revised so that the data that you want is not at the place that it is. And I don't want to go into a tirade because I'm a researcher and I keep using these websites all the time. And I know the levels of frustration that even a person who's invested in that topic has with the website. So I can totally imagine a casual consumer who is actually just looking for one piece of information, which is that what is the progress of the real estate project in which he has invested, right? And the chances that he will hang on and keep going back to the website because it doesn't work or he can't really understand it are extremely low. So completely with you on that, Shilpa, which is that we can actually make things much easier for consumers to be better aware. And this takes me a concept that I can't but think of right now is the Land Record Services Index, right? Which is another initiative that I think Omidyar has supported. So just to give the listeners, we hosted an episode previously on this, but in short, what does this index do? It compares the quality of digitization of land records across states on various parameters and assigns scores to states. Will it make the consumers better aware? No, maybe not. But can we actually compare RERA, which is what I think this report partly does? Can we compare the capacity of real estate regulatory authorities across states in such that we can assign scores and we sort of push this spirit of competitive federalism, which incentivizes each state to invest more in building capacity within its regulator? I think it's a doable idea. I think whether we like it or not, that's what the World's Bank Ease of Doing Business actually tried to do. It's what the Land Record Services Index, which is hosted by the NCAR is trying to do. So the point about websites actually took me back to that. And it also takes me back to the question of, the fact that these websites are not so viewer friendly or consumer friendly actually makes a case for an aggregator platform. I mean, as cliche as it sounds, it seems like aggregator platforms are some of the ways in which you can sort to go around this problem, where a business that's actually invested in making information access easier actually aggregates the information on this website and makes it easier for the consumer to access information, right? So that was a thought that I had, but who knows? That also actually, the point about 5 out of 6 consumers actually trust RERA enough to go to them in case they see a dispute with the developer. And that brings me to Neetu's point, which is that What will RERA do? Okay, like you mentioned, there are two choices. The RERA will either pull up the developer and penalize the developer, because RERA can't actually solve a problem between the consumer and the developer. And penalizing the developer doesn't really help the consumer, because actually, that's not going to get him the house that he wants on time, or so on and so forth. So this takes me back again. To step into history, just the history of development of regulators in India, which is, think about our SEBI or think about RBI, right? And today, I mean, rightly or wrongly, any consumer who has a grievance against a broker or against an issuer who hasn't paid interest on his bonds, I mean, SEBI and RBI are tagged all the time on social media, where consumers want to voice their grievance. And social media, rightly or wrongly, has become some sort of a tool of consumer grievance redressal. And when you consistently tag a particular issuer or a particular broker, the regulator is likely to pick it up and actually, hopefully, if it has the capacity, begin investigation. And the existence and the threat of that itself disincentivizes the regulated entity from giving grief to its consumers. So I agree. I mean, we have to see how capacity develops over time, but there are some really easy, low-hanging fruit, like Shilpa mentioned, which is, create an index, compare the regulatory authorities, see how they rank them, how they're doing well vis-a-vis each other on things like consumer access to information, ease of access to information, enforcement, and so on and so forth. Before we conclude, since this podcast is called Land of a Billion, I have to ask this question, that if you had to pick one core challenge that India needs to focus on for securing land rights for its billion plus population, what would you put your weight behind? What is that one core challenge that you would choose to tackle? Let's begin with Neetu.
Thanks. I think, yeah, we've spoken enough. It's tough to pick, but I would say my biggest bet would be on driving consumer awareness and education on RERA. Because I believe if everybody knows about it, social media is a great platform. They can also officially go to the appellate tribunals. I think if enough people know what their rights are, how much money do they need to put as an upfront payment, what is the status that they need to demand from the developer, and if he or she doesn't abide by that, what are the options available for them? If everybody knows it, I think there'll be a way for developers to self correct. So I would place my big bet on consumer awareness and education.
Fantastic. Shilpa, what do you have to say? What's that one core challenge?
Bhargavi, I think, when every Indian feels secure about buying a home or their land, and also feels comfortable that if they ever need to, transact on it, it can be done easily and smoothly. I think that's when, we can really feel happy about the land for billion.
Yeah, but that's got many elements to it, right? So, I mean, I agree with you that we have to enhance confidence in consumers, but there's the part about title, there's the part about developer performance of obligations, there's tenure security, another area that I know is of interest to you. So, if I had to tangibly identify one challenge, where do you think we should work on?
Yeah, it's like
It's hard,
it's
yeah.
in a sense all of them, Bhargavi, because it really takes all of them to reach where we want to go. But I guess if you were to really pin me down, I would say it's feeling secure that when you know this is yours, you've paid money for it, it is truly yours, and feeling secure about that. I think to me it's that security.
Got it. Okay. So great talking to both of you. And I hope that our listeners enjoy this podcast.
Thanks for the opportunity.
Great being here, Bhargavi.
Thanks for tuning in to our podcast, Land of a Billion, produced in association with the Property Rights Research Consortium. Don't forget to catch new episodes every alternate Friday, where I will bring you a rundown on the latest charcha around land and housing in India.
Thanks for listening. Log on to the Quint's website and check out our other podcasts.